What motivates me to make videos is often I'm walking down the street, listening to a podcast, and I just, right there, then and there in the moment, I've got to get home and I've got to record something. And actually, I had this a few days ago. I was listening to an interview with Keir Starmer in the Financial Times, and here's what he said.
I wanted to start with a challenge that faces you, but frankly also faces your partners in Europe too, which is that voters seem to be pretty fed up with mainstream politicians. You see extreme parties on the populist right rising in both places. Here, our polling shows that reform is far ahead of you. Chancellor Merz has said that he thinks it's the last chance for the centre in Germany. Do you think it is the case here too? That you are the last chance for the centre?
Yes. I think this is the real test of centrist politics. And I don't mean Labour versus Tories, because to some extent that's what we've had. It's a different proposition. And we have to show that politics can deliver.
What a centrist professes to believe, really, is that they want to reject political extremes, as they would see it, both on the left and the right. And what they want to do is chart a middle ground, a middle course towards what they see as being sensible mainstream politics. So one way of looking at centrism is that it is the adults in the room taking over. And look, you had this kind of discourse, didn't you, about Keir Starmer before he took power, with lots of columnists, particularly in The Guardian, wiping their brow and saying, oh my God, thank God the adults are back in charge. And people like me were immediately warning that centrism had been a pretty okay vehicle for getting Keir Starmer into power, but it wasn't going to have the necessary intellectual resources to sustain him in office, because fundamentally it was and remains ideologically empty. Now, you could see that as a benefit of centrism, right? And I think it has been a benefit of centrism in the past. Tony Blair was a centrist. Blair said about the Third Way that it was an attempt to occupy what he called the radical centre in politics. But look, Blair was much more nimble politically, and he at least tried to root his version of centrism in some sort of intellectual substance. There was a guy called Anthony Giddens, a really famous sociologist, and he came up with this idea of the Third Way. And what he said Blair was trying to do, and he used lots of academic jargon, he said that Blair was trying to triangulate between the social democracy that Britain had seen in the 1970s and the Thatcherism that Britain had seen in the 80s and the 90s, and that what Blair represented was what Giddens called a third way politics, trying to find a middle ground between Thatcherism and social democracy. So there was a little bit more intellectual heft to Blair's form of centrism, but fundamentally what centrists seem to be arguing is that politics moves beyond left and right, I think is how they'd put it, and that politics is much more about the adults in the room running the ship of state better than the nutters who might otherwise take office, the extremes in politics. And that is their appeal to the electorate, right? So I think on some level, what people like Keir Starmer believe, and what's his name, Morgan McSweeney in Number 10, part of what they believe is that when push comes to shove at the next election, the British people will look at the alternatives, they'll look at the Green Party and your party on the left, they'll look at Reform UK on the right and the Tories, and they will be horrified by those two extremes, and then they'll look at Keir Starmer or whoever it is, maybe someone like Wes Streeting would be their preferred candidate, and they'll opt for the sensibles to be in charge. And I think on some level, that's just what they think the British public will do, that they've got this faith that politics is almost like a pendulum, right? And that when it swings to an extreme, it's almost like a gravitational pull, right? That it's bound to move back to the centre. And this is why centrists were so confused by Brexit. It's why they were so confused by Donald Trump. Because what they can't understand is a politics that is that doesn't abide by what they see as political laws of nature, almost like gravity. They think that there's some idea in politics that politics has to return to the centre ground at some point. And they believe this almost like an article of faith. So when centrist candidates like Hillary Clinton get defeated by Donald Trump, for a centrist, it's like, oh my God, what's happened? They can't really compute it. And part of the reason for this is that fundamentally, they see centrism as an important mechanism for winning and keeping power. So essentially what they believe is that there are political and economic constraints that operate upon parties, particularly parties on the centre-left, and that what they are the kind of sensible adults that are going to chart a course to win power and keep power for the centre or the centre-left. And this is why they hate the left, right? Because for them, the left represent a threat to them being able to win and keep power, right? Because they see the left as, well, let's just be blunt. They see the left as a bunch of cranks who sacrifice power for ideological purity. But look, what's my view? I think that centrists have just failed to understand politics for about the last decade, maybe more. They didn't realise, I don't think, that the financial crisis, austerity, the pandemic, that these events, particularly the financial crisis, have fundamentally shaken up our politics in really significant ways, and that there are deep structural problems with our economy, and that politics in those circumstances, particularly in those circumstances, can't just be about technocratic managerialism. Politics has got to offer material changes to people. It's got to highlight a constituency of voters that it wants to appeal to, and it needs to make a material difference to their lives. And look, that can happen on the right or on the left. In fact, I always argue that Thatcher's one of the best examples of this, right? What Thatcher does when she comes to power in the late 70s is she says, I'm going to be in favour of upper middle class people, and I'm going to create a form of politics that puts their interests first, front and centre, even if that means I need to take on the entrenched interests, as she saw, of the trade union movement. And she went ahead with that, and she was successful because by the time the 1983 election came along, she brought inflation down, and she'd started to cut people's taxes, and she'd started to create a set of winners under Thatcherism. Now look, that's no longer my form of politics. I used to be a Thatcherite, by the way. I'm a reformed Thatcherite. I'm now a socialist. But I think we can learn something from politicians like that on the right. Because for me, what politics needs to be about is making a material difference to people's lives. And the problem for centrists and the problem for centrist politics is that for them, politics really, if you boil it down, is simply about winning and keeping power. And this reduces politics to being almost like a game that you play with people's lives, right? It's like a game of chess, and the mega brains who are around people like Keir Starmer, so people like Morgan McSweeney or Dominic Cummings on the other side, their job is to like game it out. And the problem is, we're not stupid. The public have kind of seen through all of this. Just to give one example, the strategists said to Keir Starmer, go into the next election and have this set of fiscal rules and say you're not going to put up taxes on working people. And then when the budget comes along, what you're going to say is, oh my God, look at this massive black hole. We're going to have to put up taxes, right? But everyone knew they were going to do that, right? It was so bloody transparent. And I think a lot of the reason why people are annoyed with the Labour Party actually is because they've not been clever and they have been dishonest, and people can see that. And really what people understand is that politics isn't a game. It's something that affects all of our lives. And to reduce it to a game, to reduce it to a kind of strategic exercise that's about winning and keeping power for your particular faction, I mean, bluntly, it's disgusting. It's disgusting what the Labour right have done to the Labour Party in the name of centrism. And so, yeah, I guess on some level, if I hear anybody in politics, or if I was to rank what I hear in politics, political centrists come pretty close to the top of the list for me, because they are vicious, particularly against the left. Not because they believe in some grand vision or there's some like ideological disagreement, but because they think the left will get in the way of them winning and keeping in power. And for me, that is just disgusting. And it's not what politics should be about or can be about. And that's why sometimes I think I've got more in common with, people on the right who I disagree with, who at least have an idea of what they want to change about society. So there we go. Let me know what you think. And look, I particularly want to know what you think if you are a centrist. Maybe I've been unfair. Personally, I don't think I have, but I'd love to hear from you. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. But for now, goodbye and best wishes.